I think another great example of this romanticism, or dare I say revisionism, of historical female achievement is Ada Lovelace, a mathematical wunderkind who grew up to become a close associate of Charles Babbage. Lovelace is widely credited as being the world's first computer programmer, having published a paper which included an algorithm to compute Bernoulli numbers on Babbage's non-existent hypothetical mechanical computer called the analytical engine. There's quite a good 3-part series that Computerphile did on the work of Babbage and Lovelace, wherein David Brailsford suggests that Lovelace really saw past the technological limitations of her era and recognised that with sufficiently complex algorithms, novel problems could be mechanically solved, even creative problems like the ability to generate music. It's all very inspiring. Don't get me wrong, I find her an interesting historical oddity as much as anyone else. However, my problem with all this romanticisation of Lovelace and her work is that the question really needs to be asked, what was her actual contribution to the field of computer science? In other words, how much of our modern computing technology is ultimately based on her ideas and her research? In much the same way that religious fanatics can look back and interpret vague passages from Revelations as being holy prophecy which predicted satellite television, it is very easy for us to look back with 2020 hindsight and interpret an otherwise obscure mathematician like Lovelace as being a computer genius a century ahead of her time. And whilst there may even be some modicum of truth underlying that assessment, the real-world question still remains: how do her quantifiable achievements actually stack up against someone like Alan Turing? Lovelace's work was entirely theoretical. To this day, there is still no working model of Babbage's analytical engine, meaning that her Bernoulli algorithm was never actually run and tested. To the extent that her ideas appear interesting and ahead of their time, it is all being interpreted in hindsight from the view of our 21st century internet-connected ivory towers. But in terms of real, practical application, her work was and remains to this very day fucking useless. Her work ultimately amounts to nothing more than the musings, albeit interesting musings, of a 19th century aristocrat whose lofty ideas never saw fruition and fell into complete obscurity for over a century, until eventually being rediscovered in recent years and shared around with some degree of hobby interest on our modern digital internet, that Lovelace and her work actually had no hand in creating. The pioneers of digital computing during the 1930s and 40s did their work completely unaware that Babbage and Lovelace had ever existed. The unfortunate truth is, if Lovelace had succumbed to consumption, polio, or cholera during childhood, the modern world would not miss her contribution to the field of computer science one iota. Her work ultimately had zero impact on our world. And yet today, certain agenda-driven revisionists, blinded by a combination of feminism and 21st century hindsight, are trying their damnedest to credit her with far more than she actually deserves. Ada's algorithm: how Lord Byron's daughter Ada Lovelace launched the digital age. Full disclosure, I have not read this book, but just based on the title alone, I suspect it is probably full of shit, given that Babbage's analytical engine was designed to perform decimal computations. In fact, apart from a few musings by Gottfried Leibniz on the subject, the idea of binary logic and computation had not even occurred to people by the early 19th century. Frankly, if anyone from that era could be credited with laying the groundwork for our modern information age, that person would undoubtedly be George Boole, whose mathematical ideas would eventually lead to the development of Boolean algebra, the logical backbone behind today's digital computation. His ideas on binary logic were comprehensively laid out in his book The Laws of Thought, published in 1854. 2 years after Lovelace had already died, meaning that, far from launching the digital age, Lovelace more than likely remained ignorant of such concepts her entire life. Alan Turing, by comparison, devised the world's first mathematical model for a universal digital computer, the Turing machine. His simple instruction set for read, write, go to, and conditional statements, which manipulated an arbitrary amount of memory, laid the very foundational groundwork for all modern computer science, with all modern computers, even the latest greatest threadrippers, being quote-unquote Turing complete. He designed and built the cryptographic bomb, a complicated electromechanical computer which allowed the English to decipher the Nazi Enigma code. He wrote papers and mathematical proofs about the practical limitations on computer programming, such as the halting problem, as well as other papers on reaction diffusion systems which help explain the mechanics behind organic cell growth. He's even one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence research, devising the imitation game commonly known today as the Turing test, wherein a blind observer interacts with a computer console and has to determine whether or not they are interacting with a computer program or another human being on another terminal. There is a lot of criticism to be levelled at the Turing test. For one thing, as a true test of intelligence, it could quite easily be cheated with a relatively simple program like ELIZA, which utilised a phrase list and pattern matching. It was also fairly academic at the time that Turing devised it, as the computers of the day were nowhere near advanced enough to pass such a test. In fact, his initial idea for a Turing test appearing in his 1948 paper Intelligent Machinery actually proposed an experiment wherein several people played chess, but some of those players were secretly following an algorithmic rule set known as a paper machine. Nonetheless, unlike the theoretical work of Lovelace, which has amounted to absolutely fucking zilch over the last century, the Turing test is still used to this day as a practical yardstick to assess real-world functional systems like internet chatbots, which are becoming more and more common as first points of contact for customer service and technical support on internet websites like eBay and Amazon. A radical feminist I went to college with once told me rather matter-of-factly that it was called history because it was his story. Well, that's undoubtedly difficult logic to argue against, but seriously, is that really true? We refer to Alan Turing as the father of modern computing, whilst Lovelace and her work remains relatively obscure. Is it really all the result of a sexist conspiracy by the patriarchy to gaslight the historical achievements of women? Or is it simply the fact that in real practical terms, Ada Lovelace actually contributed sweet fuck all to our modern information age? I recently got a subscription to Audible, and I was surprised, although perhaps I shouldn't have been, when I stumbled on their page for history books. Let me ask you this. When you think of fascinating figures in history, who do you think of? Galileo, Aristotle, Henry VIII, Muhammad Ali, Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, Nikola Tesla, Teddy Roosevelt, Christopher Columbus, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, JFK, Winston Churchill, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan? Or do you think of women and only women? Yeah, forget Genghis Khan, the real fascinating figures of history were actually the Mongol queens. And what about the aforementioned Alan Turing, father of modern computing? Well, perhaps he'll get a passing mention in The Bletchley Girls. Yeah, the irony is not lost on me that these are not even historical figures, but rather historical groups. Under a section titled Fascinating Figures in History, they couldn't even highlight individual females interesting enough to justify their own eponymous books. History is apparently no longer about history, it's about appeasing the collective inferiority complex of women. And as it turns out, they have every reason to feel inferior. History is in fact his story, but not for the reasons of patriarchal gaslighting that my feminist classmate believed. History, real history, ultimately tells the long, protracted saga of male achievement against adversity, taking our species on a perilous 10,000-year voyage all the way from mud huts to the surface of the moon. This real history is then appended by a long list of postmodernist footnotes wherein women attempt to ride the coattails of men, expecting the same praise and adoration for what has already been achieved, as if these Johnny-come-lately females were somehow equal contributors to our species' present success.